there was malinvestments, bad investments that were made for a long period of time because interest rates were too low. The money supply was too high. The Fed was buying too many bonds and keep interest rates artificially low. And that leads to booms and busts throughout different orders of production throughout the economy. And a lot of those have to correct in order for us to have a more robust and flourishing future. Hello, welcome to this week's economy. I'm your host, Dr. Vance Ginn. Thank you for joining me for episode 76. We've got a lot to talk about from what's happened over the last week and what's to come. So let's get right to it. So number one, will the Fed cut interest rates? In the news, in his speech at Jackson Hole last Friday, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell said it's time to cut rates. This comes shortly before the Fed's next meeting in mid-September. My take, as it has been for a while, is the Fed is always behind the curve, and it's going to be behind the curve again this time. The problem was that they led to a huge boom, and now there's going to be a bust cycle. And so when you have that much money put into the economy, remember their balance sheet went from $4 trillion up to $9 trillion. It's still at $7.1 trillion today, just a massive amount of money that's been put into the economy. And if the supply of goods and services don't increase at the same rate, which they have not, then you get massive inflation. And so while the inflation rate has been moderating from 9% a couple years ago to about 3% today, that's good news, but it's still up from where it was before. And this is one reason why people are saying, well, wages are coming up faster than inflation here recently. But you got to remember that for a long time, it was not. And actually since January of 2021, when Biden took office, you still have average weekly earnings that are down compared to CPI inflation and even PCE inflation. So this is not a good situation for Americans. And while it would be nice to see lower interest rates as mortgage rates are going up and the car loan rates and investment rates are going up and everything else, or loan rates are going up, those are costly. I would love to see them come down to allow for maybe more growth or investments and things of that nature. Just remember that there was malinvestments, bad investments that were made for a long period of time because interest rates were too low. The money supply was too high. The Fed was buying too many bonds and keep interest rates artificially low. And that leads to booms and busts throughout different orders of production throughout the economy. And a lot of those have to correct in order for us to have a more robust and flourishing future. And so while there may be a little bit more pain for a while from higher interest rates, I think that's going to be the cost of it. So my guess is that Jerome Powell and the Fed will lower interest rates. They'll cut the interest rate for about 25 basis points in September from 5.25 to 5.5% to in that current range to 5 to 5.25%. But I don't think that's a good idea. I think they should focus on cutting their balance sheet. And I know I've said this a lot, but I'll keep saying it. But this was the meeting at Jackson Hole from the Fed. And so we'll see what happens next. Number two, Harris's economic policy. In the news, as part of her economic policy plan to tackle inflation, Vice President Kamala Harris suggests price controls. This policy will likely make matters worse and distract from better solutions. She also proposes other policies on housing and tax credits, like child tax credit. My take is that, look, we shouldn't be picking more winners and losers throughout the tax code or on the spending side. And I think her policies have getting it all wrong. When you think about the child tax credit, that it has incentives not to work because you're getting money just for the number of kids you have. It can also put in perverse incentives for people to have kids, especially lower income people, to get those additional amount of money. It doesn't influence me because I know how much it costs to have kids. It's much more expensive than a $5,000 or $6,000 child tax credit per year. Maybe that helps a little bit, but you also got to remember that as soon as we start getting that additional money, a lot of that goes into consumption. And if it goes into consumption, demand increases, and then we see higher prices for those same goods and services that we were buying. And so there's really an impetus to continue to increase the child tax credit over time. I also don't think we should pick winners and losers, picking winners as families who have kids versus those families who can't have kids or that choose not to have kids. Why should that be a part of tax policy in general? We should want the broadest base with the lowest base, the lowest rate possible. And that gives more freedom and liberty to families, no matter what they decide to do with having kids or not and everything else. And look, I get it. The cost of parenting has gone up. I have 3 young kids myself. But the way to do that is to look at inflation coming from Congress's overspending and the Fed printing too much money. That, if we can get the control of that, we'll see much lower inflationary pressures across the economy and more affordability to have kids. Also, this $25,000 increase in new first-time home buyers for a subsidy for people to buy homes. What's that going to do? That's going to increase demand without the same increases in supply, and you're going to get higher prices. So all of that $25,000 is withered away very quickly. And so this is another reason why this is a bad policy, and it'll be very costly to taxpayers, not only because their housing values are going to go up and they're going to pay higher property taxes and other things, but also it's going to mean that people who are trying to buy things are going to see prices go up all around them, including housing. And so it's going to be less affordable in the future. Remember, nothing is free, and there are all these trade-offs. And so these are major trade-offs that are going to happen. And both of them also should get away from, tariffs and everything else. So I don't think these are good ideas. So hopefully they'll change them up. I'm doubtful that they will, but I want to give you the facts instead of the noise. So number 3. RFK Jr. backs Trump for president. In the news, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has suspended his campaign to endorse Trump for president, with a potential promised role for him in a Trump administration. In fact, he is now on the transition team. And so this is, along with Tulsi Gabbard, this is something that probably going to be in the works for a while. It's interesting, just given RFK Jr., kind of his history and his family's history of being Democrats, that he would be in support of a Republican. But I think from some of his positions on COVID and the lockdowns, the vaccines, wars, and having more peace versus wars, I think he feels like Trump would be a better candidate compared to Harris whenever it comes to the presidential election. So it's interesting to see how that would take place. And I'm hopeful that we can get more pro-growth policies. At the end of the day, I want to see more people prosper and have more peace and prosperity. So I think from that sense, I was glad to hear what RFK Jr. was saying, including some of his points against the lockdowns and the COVID issues that were going on. So this is something that we'll need to watch moving forward. Number 4. School choice needed in Texas, as I've mentioned several times already. So in the news, despite poor student outcomes and major housing affordability issues in Austin, Texas, the school district is pushing for higher taxes and debt to fund increased spending. Data shows the large growth in administrative staff at public schools nationwide, showing the school systems are a big jobs program for adults. In fact, this article, the Austin American-Statesman said Austin students return to schools Tuesday as the district grapples with cutting down a $119 billion deficit. Look, there's no budget deficits that are going on at these schools. What happened is that they over budgeted. They thought there was going to be more money that was going to be passed by the legislature, but a lot of the rural Republicans and the Democrats voted against that additional funding because it tied to a small school choice element of ESAs, about $500 million compared to the $7 billion they were going to add to the government school system. And so when that didn't go through, they had already budgeted this extra amount of increases in revenue, expected increase in revenue, and that never happened. That never materialized, along with the fact that a lot of enrollment declines at places like Austin ISD because of poor performances and higher housing prices. People can't afford these areas, so they're moving out to the suburbs, which is where I live in Round Rock. And so what we're seeing is another example of government trying to become bigger and get more funding, even when student outcomes are declining substantially. We've also seen record amounts of spending in Texas on public schools and public education system. And this is why we also need school choice. We need universal education savings accounts where the dollars follow the student, not the system. And every dollar should be funded this way, not through the school finance systems we have today, to where if you want to go to a public school, then you go to that public school, you take that education savings account and make sure that it's paid there, or you take it to a private school, homeschool, co-op, or other things that you as parents want to do. That's really where we should be going. I mean, 12 states have already been working on this. I had a recent piece in the American Institute for Economic Research highlighting that, and Texas should stop following and start leading, because if not, we're going to continue to run into these problems of people saying we need to spend more money and getting worse outcomes outcomes or not as good outcomes over time. There's no correlation between the two. So that's what's going on there. Number 5, cities in red states see population boom. In the news, the 5 cities with the biggest population gains are all in red states with the right to work laws, lower income taxes, and lower state and local tax burdens. In employment news, though, jobless claims rose more than predicted to 232,000, showing a cooling in labor market conditions. As I've noted before in the state level jobs report that came out here recently, there was indication that 22 of the 50 states had lost jobs. More than half the states have had increases in unemployment rates, and this is more indication of that. Where are they moving to, though? They're moving to red states with lower taxes, lower spending, lower regulation, more economic growth, and more jobs, and more of those places are in cities in those red states, like Houston, Dallas, Miami, you name it. But they're moving away from California, Illinois, New York, and it's unfortunate that Kamala Harris wants to send us more in that direction, just like the Biden administration did. It's one reason why we have such a fragile economy, that people can't keep up with what's going on all around them. And so I think this is another situation where we've got to look at what the states are doing for things that maybe the federal government should also do. If we get that done, I think we'll do a lot more right, because federalism is so important to our lives. Number 6, tariffs are taxes. In the news, a recent article notes, quote, J.D. Vance thinks Donald Trump's tariffs actually worked. In a cable news segment this weekend, Vice Presidential contender J.D. Vance defended his running mate's first term tariff policies. My perspective is on this is that, tariffs are taxes, right? And so anytime you increase something, you're going to get less of it. But remember that tariffs are paid by Americans. I don't know how many times I have to say this, but tariffs are taxes that we pay on the imports from other countries, whether it's from China, Mexico, India, or something else. We pay that tax. So there's an argument that if you raise that tariff, that the price of those items will go up, we'll buy less of it, and maybe we'll produce more here if we want to keep consuming it. The problem is with that is that it's very it takes more time to bring on those supply chains and production. And a lot of the items that we're importing are actually inputs, intermediate goods that we use for final goods here in America. So if you start to raise those prices just get pushed up throughout the supply chain for those particular items. Now, this does not raise the overall level of inflation. Remember, that comes from the Federal Reserve's excessive money printing, but prices do go up for those particular items. There is a case, right, that if the tariffs go into place, we get less demand, we get more demand for the dollar because we have less money that's going elsewhere, and so that appreciates the dollar. And so if you have a 10% increase in tariffs, you might actually see a 10% increase in appreciation of the dollar. So there's not a large change in the price of that particular good. The problem with all of, and then you also have retaliatory tariffs. So the China or other countries will put in tariffs of their own. So now you have this back and forth, which can kind of wash out the overall price effects. But what it does do is it influences the supply chains and the production processes of these goods that are added these taxes on. And it makes it to where the economy is not as efficient, and it creates more distortions, fewer jobs, and less economic output. What we saw with the steel tariffs during the Trump administration is that a lot of others in the supply chain also increased their prices, or they had to make layoffs or they had to shut down because they had these higher prices and higher costs that went along with it. And so this is not a good idea. We need free trade with free market capitalism to support more abundant resources and the most prosperous people, not only here, but across the globe. So another things we have going on is media hits and others. This week I published pieces, given quotes, and completed interviews at Fox Business with Neil Cavuto on inflation and the Fed. Don't miss that. I had a great discussion on the Parent Empowerment podcast put out by the Texas Public Policy Foundation with Mandy Drogan on the importance of school choice and school finance reform in Texas. Don't miss that one as well. I was on NTD News on the failure of tariffs, like I mentioned a minute ago, among other topics. The American Institute for Economic Research, I had that piece on Texas need to pass school choice. Real Clear Health, I had a piece co-authored with Dr. Dean Waldman on the cure for the healthcare affordability crisis. Don't miss that one. The Let People Prosper show this week is with Paul Tice. We had a great discussion on how will ending ESG fuel energy abundance. And so we talked a lot about ESG and his book, The Race to Zero, how ESG investing will crater the global financial system. This coming Tuesday's episode 112 of the Let People Prosper Show is with Dr. Abby Blanco. We talk about her new co-authored book with Dr. Chris Coyne, who's been on the program before, titled How to Run Wars, a confidential playbook for the national security elite. It's a great discussion. You don't want to miss it this week. Quote of the week is by Milton Friedman. Quote, "To the free men, the country is the collection of individuals who compose it, not something over and above them. He is proud of a common heritage and loyal to common traditions, but he regards government as a means and instrumentality, neither as a grantor of favor of gifts, not a master or God to be blindly worshiped and served." Very true. Bible verse of the week is Galatians 5:14. Love your neighbor as yourself. I hope you're loving your neighbors. Thank you for joining me again today. God bless you and your family. Remember, you can find all the show notes at vanceginn.substack.com or go to vanceginn.com to find them as well. So until next time, let people prosper.